So I've talked a bit already about Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, on this channel. And I think through the interviews that I've shown and some of the passages from the book, it's become pretty clear that his main motivation isn't about just understanding the scriptures better, helping people to understand the scriptures better, but rather he seems motivated by a disdain for empowered women, for assertive women. And he complains a lot about the gynocracies that women create when they're given power in a culture or in politics. And so he says that he wrote the book explicitly for Protestant men. And I think it was to give these men a weapon to use in this fight against empowered women in culture and politics. But nonetheless, some people still might ask, well, okay, so he's kind of a small man, but what about his ideas? Are his ideas biblical? And the answer to that question is emphatically no, they're not. Now, when I read the book, I wasn't surprised to find that he didn't make a convincing biblical argument. I don't think there is a convincing biblical argument for Christian nationalism. What surprised me was that he didn't even attempt a biblical argument for Christian nationalism. Now, the danger in getting too deep in the theological weeds with a guy like this is that it feeds this illusion that his book has anything to do with actual biblical Christian belief. I mean, he didn't sit down with his Bible and read it and go, oh my gosh, Christian nationalism. He started with a desire for a country that's ruled by Protestant men. And then he reverse engineered a political theology to sort of help bring that little utopia about. And he doesn't claim to base his argument on Scripture. He admits this up front. He writes, "This is a work of Christian political theory. It's not overall a work of political theology. I assume the Reformed theological tradition, and so I make little effort to exegete biblical text. Some readers will complain that I rarely appeal to Scripture to argue for my positions." And they have. Critics have complained about this very point. And he responds in one way by saying that, well, if you're writing a book about some theological issue and you happen to reference the Trinity, you don't feel the need to biblically support the Trinity just in order to reference it. And I get that. My response to that is, if you write a book called The Case for the Trinity, you probably want to make a biblical argument for that. But, fair enough. I mean, he's entitled to structure his argument the way that he wants. And I would just have this pushback, which is if you're trying to convince Christian men to get militant around an agenda that includes things like depriving their wives and sisters and daughters and mothers of the right to vote, or establishing blasphemy laws, or ensuring that only Protestant men can hold positions of authority. If you're trying to do all those things and you call your book The Case for Christian Nationalism, you might want to make a biblical argument. So instead of the Bible, Wolfe uses natural law and Reformed theology and just asserts that that's biblical. And so, for instance, he would claim the Westminster Confession of Faith as like a core expression of theological truth under the Bible, of course. But the problem with that is the Westminster Confession in this particular issue is pretty weak biblically. If you look at section 23, it's talking about the relation between the civil magistrate and the church and the authority that the civil magistrate has over the church. And it's important to know that it was written in the 1640s during the English Civil War, which involved disputes about religion and the power of the king. And it's important to realize that one of its purposes was to grant legitimacy to the civil magistrate to rule in church matters and to sort of clarify how that all worked. So in 1789, the Presbyterian Church in America actually changed the Westminster Confession in specifically this section about the civil magistrate. And it's because the Americans, when they were starting the nation, wanted to get the civil magistrate out of the church business. So it was debated back and forth, of course, and there were American colonies that did have a state church for a time, but the movement in America was away from that. And if you want to see the biblical basis for the theology that Wolfe just assumes, you've got to go to the proof texts that the writers of the Westminster Confession used. And you'll find that in this section, they're really scant. When it involves the authority of the king or the authority of the civil magistrate, it's a lot of Old Testament passages having to do with Israel. There's one from Isaiah 49 that people say that it's looking forward to the Christian era, but really it's just amongst a bunch of promises to Israel about the things that they've lost being restored and kings will serve them, that sort of prophetic passage. The only New Testament passage actually that's even referenced in there is it relates to Herod having the right to call synods together to decide theological things when he calls the religious leaders of his day together to find out where the Christ child is going to be born so that he can kill him. So I don't know that I would go to that particular passage to prove this point. And that's why the American Presbyterians in 1789 were able to remove this language from the Westminster Confession. They saw that despite what they saw as solid theology, it was also a political document, and it no longer fit the political setting of the early American colonies. So it seems kind of fraudulent to me to write a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism and then rely on a convenient theological system that was written in a completely different time under an entirely different set of political assumptions and just assert that it's biblical. But Reformed theology isn't the only pillar in Wolfe's book here. The other one is natural law. His arguments are based on a combination of those two things, like I said. And he prides himself on building a systematic case, step by step. But I have serious problems with each step that he takes. He talks about how his method uses mixed syllogisms. He talks about this, meaning he can prove that one thing is true from natural law and then add in a Christian truth to complete the natural law. And so, for example, he uses the sort of argument later in the book that goes, natural principles can have supernatural conclusions. Consider the following syllogism. 1, civil government ought to direct its people to the true religion. 2, the Christian religion is the true religion. Therefore, 3, civil government ought to direct its people to the Christian religion. So I read this and I find that absolutely unconvincing. And it's frankly irritating to read page after page of this sort of stuff. He sets up these arguments that apparently seem convincing to him. And having established this point, let's move on to the next point. But he doesn't convincingly establish any of his points. So now I've probably said everything useful that I'm going to say about this. But nonetheless, I did prepare a few minutes here of a short skit just to give you a feeling of what it feels like to read this book in case you're not going to read it. So I apologize for the stock photos. I wanted to give it exactly the amount of respect that it deserved, but I can't wear hand puppets and run the keyboard. So I had to use the stock photos. Okay, here we go. Hello, we're looking to buy a car. As well you should, for doesn't nature itself teach us that humans need to get from here to there? I suppose. And having established that, simple reason tells us the best way to get from here to there is in a private motor vehicle, because private motor vehicles give you the maximum independence. They're available at will. Maybe in a place without public. And now, having established that, we can confidently assert that the best personal vehicle is one that can hold an entire family and all of their belongings. Doesn't it? And having established that, no one can deny that the ideal family unit in the eyes of God is a father, a mother, and at least 8 children. So, if you want a specifically Christian vehicle, it better be quite large. Wait, what? And moreover, given the absolute collapse of Christian culture, your vehicle must be able to store enough rations and weaponry to outlast a prolonged persecution. And having proven this point beyond any reasonable objection, it now becomes obvious that the only Christian way to travel is by personal bus. Personal bus? Now, don't question me on this, because I'm an expert on buses. I've studied buses for years. Now, as every reputable expert on buses will tell you, the golden age of the bus was the 1940s, that sweet spot when the technology was advanced, but the nanny state hadn't kicked in yet with all these feminine ideas of comfort and woke safety features. Do you even know the significance of March 8th, 1950? Of course you don't. That's the day the first tiny little VW bus went into production. At first, only degenerates drove VW buses, so people thought, well, what's the harm? But before long, someone from your own town started driving them. Then someone from your church accepts a ride in one. Well, what's the harm? Next, your daughter's dating a guy with a VW bus. Oh, they're just kids. They'll outgrow it. What's the harm? But now, some parts of the country, it seems like every other vehicle's a VW bus. But anyway, you look like a man who knows where to draw the line. And have I got the vehicle for you? I just happen to have it here on the lot. This is the only vehicle a good Christian man like yourself should be driving. Well, actually, we're looking for a car for me to drive. You see, I'm a real estate agent, and I'm looking for something comfortable but economical. Wait, what? You let her drive? You can both kindly leave my lot right now and take your woke BS with you. This is Northern Idaho, not San Fran frickin' Cisco. And scene. So, a couple of final thoughts. Too many people listen to Stephen Wolfe, and instead of laughing, they say things like, well, are you certain that the decade of the 1940s was the golden age of the bus? And a lot can be said for the 1950s. And by entering into the argument like this, it makes it seem like all the other steps along the way were valid. So I'm glad people are writing more in-depth critiques of his theology, but I've given it about as much time as I think it's worth. So as for me and my YouTube channel, it's time to move on to the fascism. And in the next few videos, I'll be looking at the link between Wolfe's brand of Christian nationalism and fascism. So that's going to require a basic treatment of what fascism is, and then I'll compare that to Wolfe's self-description of what he's trying to accomplish. Until then, thanks for listening.